It's the insecure bully thing, right? And what is always frustrating to me, and one of the reasons I wrote Strongmen, was to debunk or draw the curtain back on these myths that strongmen and their PR firms, which are often located in England or in the US, manufacture to cover up their total chaos, such as the idea that the trains run on time. That was Mussolini's. Or Hitler, he built the Autobahn. And this idea of efficiency, that's what's going on now at the Department of Government Efficiency. Or in Pinochet's time, oh, we're going to have streamlining government with neoliberal economics. It's going to be more efficient. And behind the scenes, the way these people actually run their governments is a total chaos.
This is the Rhyming Chaos podcast, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great upheaval or authoritarian takeover.
We hope these interviews can help us understand what is happening in the United States right now and how decent people can fight against it.
I'm Jeremy Goldkorn. My Jewish Latvian grandparents immigrated to South Africa before World War II, and I grew up in the apartheid era just down the road from Elon Musk. I lived in China for 20 years, and I've been living in Nashville, Tennessee, in the American South since 2015.
And I'm Maria Repnikova. My Jewish Belarusian grandmother is a Holocaust survivor. I grew up in post-Soviet Latvia and came to the United States with my mom and brother as a teenager. I have studied China and Russia for nearly 2 decades. I have been living in Atlanta, Georgia since 2016, where I teach authoritarian politics amongst other topics at Georgia State University. Today, we're really happy to be speaking to Ruth Ben-Ghiat, Professor of History and Italian Studies at New York University. She writes about fascism, authoritarianism, propaganda, and democracy protection. She's frequently interviewed and quoted in the news and writes an excellent newsletter called Lucid. It gives subscribers access to very regular Zoom calls of discussions and interviews with notable experts who help us understand what is happening in the United States.
Ruth's latest best-selling book is Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present. It was published in 2020, and it is all too relevant to our current moment. Welcome to Rhyming Chaos, Ruth.
Thank you.
Your book, Strongmen, and I quote from the blurb on your website, examines how illiberal leaders use corruption, violence, propaganda, and machismo to stay in power, and how resistance to them has unfolded over a century. The protagonists of the book are basically my wish list of topics of this Rhyming Chaos podcast. Idi Amin, Barre of Somalia, Berlusconi, Bolsonaro of Brazil, Duterte of the Philippines, Erdogan, Franco, Gaddafi, Hitler, Saddam Hussein, Modi, Mussolini, Viktor Orban, Chile's Pinochet, Putin, Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire, now called Congo, and of course, Donald J. Trump of our dear United States of America. Ruth, can you explain why you chose this group of people but did not include any of the North Korea's Kim dynasty, Mao Zedong, or Xi Jinping?
Yeah, so I'm originally a historian of fascism, and I looked around and I didn't see any book that was a history of right-wing authoritarians. I saw lots of books, let's say, on Hitler and Stalin and lots of histories of communism. But I wanted to trace the trajectory that goes from, Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco to the right-wing military dictatorships of the Cold War. And Pinochet is my main person. And then see what happens with Bolsonaro, with Trump, or with these former communists who have become kind of right-wing, which would be Putin and Orban. So that's the book that I wrote. It's not because I think that left-wing authoritarians are not equally evil and murderous. In fact, communism caused more deaths, if we're going to do numbers, than fascism. But that's the book I wanted to write because I didn't see anything around of that sort.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's talk about the preconditions that make authoritarianism possible. You write, 2 momentous events made Berlusconi's political career possible. Across Europe, the collapse of communism in 1989 to 1991 created the conditions for the rise of a new right and a new authoritarian era. In the East, hyper-nationalist and tribalist sentiments and ethnic conflicts, long managed by the Soviet system, proliferated, and the loss of state-mandated enemies liberated some to be free to hate. Immigrants provided convenient new targets. And in Western Europe, too, the eclipse of communist parties weakened the left and created a space for the right to assert itself. Sorry to read your own work to yourself, but what are the conditions, do you think, that made Trump's rise possible?
So one of the recurring things, and you cited one case, is when there appears to be a kind of vacuum in politics, when traditional parties don't seem to be meeting the needs of people, when politicians are not speaking to people in ways they feel they can embrace, or when there's a kind of rupture in politics. That was true in Italy before Berlusconi came in, because all of the major parties had disappeared due to corruption scandals. You had, Putin coming in at the behest of oligarchs in the long aftermath of the demise of communism. So you have these moments where there's some kind of void in politics. And it is then that these strongmen, especially if they have a background in marketing or in entertainment, and Mussolini was a journalist. So he came in the vacuum after World War I. Mobutu was a journalist. Berlusconi was a man of television and TV marketing. And here we have Trump, who is a very skilled marketer and a man of the image. And so he came up and he realized that there was a big constituency, the racists of every type in America, and also white working class people who were not being served by the Democratic Party. And he started speaking to them, telling them that they were forgotten, but they would be forgotten no longer. So he simulated care for these people. And that's what strongmen do. Of course, the aim is to manipulate them and exploit them as soon as they get their sympathies and their votes. But Trump was part of this tradition in scanning the marketplace, seeing a constituency he could exploit, and quite intensely and resolutely directing himself to them and creating a big tent for all extremists, all racists to feel that they would have a place, that they could be valued, even if they were neo-Nazis, like in Charlottesville. By then he was already in office. These are the moments when these strongmen know how to exploit people's grievances and fears.
You just talked about the overarching motivation of exploitation. And in your book, you write, quote, "The men, women, and children he governs have value in his eyes only insofar as they produce babies, fight his enemies, and adulate him publicly." It strikes me that this describes also Elon Musk as much as Donald Trump. Would you consider Musk as a type of business strongman? Are there similar characters allied to other strongmen that might help us understand the Musk-Trump dynamic? And what do you make of the very public feud between Trump and Musk that seems to have really accelerated today in the news?
I think there's a lot of similarities. Musk is an authoritarian personality. He was formed by apartheid in South Africa. He's like a kind of techno-fascist, and he reminds me a lot of the fascists I originally studied, who felt that they had superior genes. They wanted to save white Christian civilization, but they also felt that they and their peers had superior genes that had to be propagated, and that they alone were visionaries who could make a better future, but that better future is on the backs of people they're exploiting. And the other way that Musk is extremely similar to political authoritarians is that, as you mentioned, he truly believes that he has the right to not obey the law. This kind of arrogant person believes that they are above the law and that the law is an annoyance and that they shouldn't be beholden. They shouldn't be accountable because laws were not written for people like themselves, that they're a kind of elite. And this can extend to Peter Thiel and others of that sort. And Trump fits in well. So they're kind of kindred spirits. And perhaps it was inevitable that they formed what I've called in Lucid a power sharing agreement, which is very unique because we all know that, oligarchs can back authoritarians. It happened in not just in Russia, but post-communist places in Eastern Europe. But here, Musk was allowed to have a kind of co-leader, the appearance of a co-leader status. He got to actually stand in the Oval Office and talk to journalists. He was meeting on presidential grounds with foreign heads of state like Modi. He was in cabinet meetings speaking, and Trump made it clear that he should be listened to as though he were a leader. And so this is very unusual. It's like the oligarch isn't external anymore. He comes into And so he was allowed to then most consequentially create this kind of private civil service that was beholden only to him. That's Doge. And Doge was created so he could infiltrate the US government. That's never happened, that a private individual is allowed to infiltrate and take over part of the government of a sovereign nation. So we're writing history right now. And Doge, I think the American people and also people everywhere, they don't realize the extent to which this has, I'm going to use the word festered, as though it were an illness, because it's a pathology. Doge is either partly or wholly in control of over 30 government agencies. Again, this is an innovation of the authoritarian playbook. So the feud between them right now, I honestly, maybe I've studied too many strongmen and their dramas for too long, because these are all very impulsive, often drug-addicted people. They love drama. They make drama behind the scenes and in public. I think about Gaddafi, Idi Amin. If Trump were really serious, he would get rid of every single Doge employee from the government, and he's not doing that because he can't. Because he relies on Musk for financial support, for cryptocurrency validation. When I see dramas being manufactured by these guys, I always ask, what are they trying to distract us from? What are they hiding? That's what I care about, not their manufacturing of feud. Trump and Musk are expert manipulators of public opinion.
Okay. I guess we'll see in the coming days where this is going, because there was some rather interesting language on Twitter today from Musk about Trump is in the Epstein files. That's why he didn't release them. I mean, that strikes you as it's distraction, huh?
What I try and study, of course, I study these individuals. My book isn't biographies. It's about how individuals can alter systems of governance and personalize governance. So I'm always looking at the systemic angle. So even if this rift continues and until every last Doge employee, until Doge is truly shut down and other things have happened that truly they're severing everything, I am not going to be impressed by their fighting.
I don't know how easy it is to shut Doge down at this point with them infesting all parts of the government, as you say. You write in your book that Mussolini brought the mentality and tactics of the First World War out home and then regarded persecuting domestic enemies as a patriotic duty. And you talk about how out of the crucible of the war years came the cults of victimhood that turned emotions like resentment and humiliation into positive elements of party platforms. That very much sort of rhymes with some of what we see going on now with Trump and Musk. But I mean, the US isn't emerging from a post-war period. Trump wasn't in a war, but he does seem inspired by vengeance and a sense of victimhood and a quest for persecution of his enemies. What do you think explains this?
Well, he's repeating a playbook in some ways. The circumstances are a little different, of course, but one of the oldest authoritarian narratives is the immigrants who are coming across the border, or foreigners of some sort who are coming across the border to pollute the gene pool, take our jobs, create more crime, rape our women. This was used by Pinochet in Chile, actually, to justify why he was originally having a state of emergency, even though his coup was against the left, but they used the idea of people coming over the border. So there are certain narratives that recur because they work. And what authoritarians do is they want to get people not just polarized. And we hear about polarization a lot, and it is very destructive when it's, us versus them. But what authoritarians want to do is go beyond that to what I call survivalism. So it's not me versus you and we don't agree, but we're in the same political system. It's me or you. And only one of us can survive because there is a threat to our families, to our very survival that can only be solved by repression. And so this is very important because what Trump's been doing, just to keep to that case, he used his electoral campaign to radicalize people. It was a whole radicalization vehicle. That's why he kicked it off in Waco, Texas, which is a pilgrimage site for anti-government extremists. And he talked about immigrants in dehumanizing ways over and over again. And he had people holding signs that said mass deportation at his rally. He's an expert propagandist who guides people and conditions them emotionally. And then he gets to power and he starts deporting people, disappearing people. But he's created an emotional climate by getting people to feel that their safety and their security and that of their families and their jobs requires this extreme response.
Yeah, thinking about some contradictions of strongman leaders, you write in your book, quote, Hitler resembled many later leaders in being an indecisive and insecure ruler behind his all-powerful fur facade. His opinions sometimes reflected the last person he had spoken to. Mobutu was hardly the only authoritarian to be, quote, obsessively concerned with slights to his presidency, as U.S. Ambassador to Zaire Brandon Grove asserted. Nor was Mussolini alone in spending hours each day reading the press, quote, where every item dealing with him has been marked by subordinates. What explains this paradox, the indecisive, sensitive, and arguably an insecure strongman?
Yeah, you've hit on one of the most interesting characterological or personality things, that it's the insecure bully thing, right? And what is always frustrating to me, and one of the reasons I wrote Strongmen, was to debunk or draw the curtain back on these myths that strongmen and their PR firms, which are often located in England or in the US, manufacture to cover up their total chaos, such as the idea that the trains run on time. That was Mussolini's. Or Hitler, he built the Autobahn. And this idea of efficiency, that's what's going on now at the Department of Government Efficiency. Or in Pinochet's time, oh, we're going to have streamlining government with neoliberal economics. It's going to be more efficient. And behind the scenes, the way these people actually run their governments is a total chaos. And this is partly because of their personalities, where they're vindictive. They hire people and fire people constantly because they're insecure. I think I have a line in Strongmen. The best way to get on the bad side of a strongman is to be too competent if you're a minister, or too popular, because they're insecure people who are actually threatened by competence. And that's why they surround themselves with loyalists, with family members they can control, sons-in-law. I have a paragraph about all the sons-in-law today with, Erdogan, and there's just a whole group of these people, and Jared Kushner. So they surround themselves with people who are not going to be threatening because they're not very competent, or they're competent, but they're subordinate to them. And so we've reached the apotheosis of this in America with people like Pete Hegseth, who has not only evidently a terrible character, and his private life is a mess, has always been a mess, apparently, but has no qualifications. And the times he did direct things, he had to leave for financial impropriety accusations. We have the head of the Directorate of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, who had no experience at a high level in intelligence. And the reason the insecure strongman also puts people like that in is that somebody like that doesn't have the ability to have their own fiefdoms because they don't have the relationships if they're put into situations that are beyond their capacity, and thus they can be easily controlled. We see this in every country where you have strongmen. If somebody utters the slightest criticism, like look what's happened in Russia since the start of this genocidal war on Ukraine, there's been something the Atlantic called Russian sudden death syndrome, where so many people in the energy sector have met with surprising deaths. They've gone into hospitals and they've never come out, or they've fallen out of windows, all because they uttered some tiny criticism, or they were not professing loyalty. And it's not enough to not criticize. For the insecure strongmen, you have to be vociferously loyal. And so this leads to upheaval that has also economic consequences, as well as like governmental incompetence.
What you describe is a very scary scenario and the types of threats that people can face if they speak out. But does this paradox of overconfidence and insecurity also open up some space for productive resistance, this kind of loopholes or the weaknesses that you also outlined, do they bring in some space for something more contentious?
It can. And one of the reasons that most of them are very paranoid is that they know not only they're hated eventually by part or a majority of the population, their way of being creates within the elite class, it creates centers of resistance toward them. And so they become more paranoid. I keep thinking of Putin. It started during COVID, but it's representative where he's sitting alone at this huge table and no one can come near him. And that's why they build bunkers. They have this compulsion to possess more and more things as though it can make them feel safe.
I remember that, yeah.
Because they know that often there's something called the palace coup, that people conspire against them. And in history, that has happened many times. I just finished teaching a seminar this spring on coups. And one of the statistics is those who come in via coup are more likely to leave, to be ejected via a coup.
You've described Berlusconi as a bridge between 20th century authoritarians and today's strongmen, I think. What made him so significant in this evolution?
Yeah, I wish more people paid attention to Berlusconi and took him seriously, partly because it's Italy. I'm an Italian historian by original training, and it's frustrating to me because Mussolini is highly relevant and so is Berlusconi. Berlusconi, he broke ground, including for somebody like Trump in so many ways. He was a businessman. He was a billionaire, went into politics. He owned all of the private TV networks when he was prime minister. And Forza Italia, which was a brilliant move to call a political party the name of a soccer chant, was the first party that was actually created inside a corporation. When he created Forza Italia, he had people from his PR firms interview potential politicians and do screen tests on them. So that's one area. The second is enormous corruption. And he kind of talked always about the witch hunts against him. He would slander and smear judges, calling them, communists. And so that kind of attempt to discredit the judiciary in order to cover up your corruption, he did that too. And then the main thing he did, which hugely changed the game for the 21st century, is that he was the first politician to bring in neo-fascists into a government. He broke the taboo, which had been in place since 1945, against bringing neo-fascists into government and giving them ministerial jobs. So he brought Alleanza Nazionale. In that way, he normalized this extremism. He also would always make comments. He said things like Mussolini never killed anyone. And so he both set up the far right to be a player and normalized in politics in the future, and he whitewashed the fascist past in ways that we see people doing today. So he was extremely important in all of these ways. And the last thing I'll mention is he was a major enabler and partner of Putin. They were very close. And nowadays, Putin partners like Trump are required to repeat the propaganda line that today it's, NATO is to blame of Ukraine. Or Biden created the problem and Putin had to go in there. That's what Trump said. It was Biden and NATO who created this problem, and then Putin had to go in Ukraine to solve it. Well, in Berlusconi's time, he started talking about NATO as creating a problem, which is why Putin had to go in Crimea. So it's the same playbook, and they also had dirty deals about pipelines and Nord Stream. So all of that is why Berlusconi was a real pioneer in a bad way, but is routinely overlooked.
Do you think Trump is in some ways consciously learning from Berlusconi, or do you think this behavior is sort of typical behavior of a strongman and therefore they behave in similar ways?
Yeah, that's always a good question. Trump doesn't read, so he's not reading some kind of manual or my book or anything. But these guys watch what each other does. So from the days that Hitler worshipped Mussolini, he even, at one point in the 1920s, he had a bust of Mussolini on his desk, and the other Nazis were making fun of him. And one of them said he suffered from Mussolini intoxication because he was so impressed. He wanted to be Mussolini. And so they look at what each other is getting away with. And Trump is very much like that. He aspires to have the kind of power that Xi Jinping has. Again, it's across the political spectrum. He doesn't care if it's the leader of North Korea, if it's a communist, if it's neo-fascist. He doesn't care. He wants that kind of power. So he looks at what they're able to get away with, and he wants that for himself. And that's why if we look at who he has praised, it's never been any Democratic leader, ever. That's scary. He has only praised the worst dictators around today. He's even sent people now, since he came into office, to make friendly with Belarus. Because if you're a real Putin partner, you have to be on good terms with Putin's clients.
Yeah. You already talked about this a little bit in the beginning of our interview, but can you say something more about how Berlusconi's media empire shaped Italian politics in ways that prefigured a current media landscape?
Yeah, so it was very unusual for someone who owned all of the private TV networks and all of the major TV advertising firms to also be the prime minister. So there was massive conflict of interest. Now, in theory, Berlusconi had entrusted his holdings to his kids and to an associate who was a senator. So that doesn't make any sense either, Marcello Dell'Utri. But it gave him the power to shape the narrative that no one had ever had before. And it also gave him the power to develop a personality cult that was the biggest one in Italy since Mussolini. And he consciously modeled himself on Mussolini's personality cult. He even reprised some of the slogans that Mussolini used about himself, and he put in his name Berlusconi instead. So it gave him a huge advantage, and he had been allowed to privatize because Italy had state television. But what happened is over time, he was able to exert influence and pressure on state TV. And so gradually everything shifted over to the right politically. And also he was able to have his corruption covered up. So with strongmen, whether they're left or right wing, it's always, they generate noise, that's propaganda, but they also require silence. There are things you cannot talk about. And we know that many people have been killed, investigative journalists around the world, for saying things that strongmen want covered up. So Berlusconi survived so long despite so many corruption trials because he was able to pressure the media and also through lawsuits. That's the 21st century strongman's tool. The fear of prosecution, the fear of litigation, in order to keep things silent that he wanted covered up.
You've also touched on this a little bit, but what role did business elites play in enabling Berlusconi's rise? And how does this parallel what we're seeing in the United States?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because unlike Trump, who simulated success and in fact had failure after failure with legitimate businesses, Berlusconi was a successful billionaire. He was very corrupt, but he was a successful billionaire. And so he was able to attract big industry. And this was very interesting and smart of him. He came in first, he started Forza Italia in the early 90s. And not only had the Christian Democrat Party disappeared due to a corruption scandal, but the Communist Party, which was the largest communist party in Western Europe, had disappeared because of the fall of communism. And yet, Berlusconi, good old Berlusconi, expert propagandist, knew you had to have that anti-communist propaganda. So he talked about himself as saving Italy from communism, even though communism had just collapsed. And it worked. He had this famous poster that was per un miracolo italiano, for an Italian miracle. So he set himself up. And that was supposed to be about business and the economy as well. And so Berlusconi was very smart at pioneering or reviving, we could say, what I call in my book, the authoritarian bargain. And he did it also with the church and all the major interest groups. And so the authoritarian bargain is you get elites, major sectors of society, to partner with you, and you allow them to prosper. In return, they support you no matter what you say or do. And so he had certain liaisons. One of the most important was Marcello Dell'Utri, who was a Forza Italia senator. He was the liaison to Opus Dei, to the Catholic Church, but the Opus Dei in particular, very powerful. And at the same time, he was also the liaison to the mafia. He was actually, this Marcello Dell'Utri, was convicted in 2003 of mafia association. He was Berlusconi's right-hand man. He was a senator, and he was convicted of mafia association. And he kept on being a senator despite that conviction.
Yeah, amazing.
So he had the church, he had organized crime, and he was the titular head of Berlusconi's Publitalia, all at once. So that's an example of how Berlusconi worked through these like emissaries and partners.
Pretty incredible network. Yeah.
It's incredible.
When we think about the lessons from Berlusconi's decades in power that democracies should have learned but didn't, can you point to some of them for our listeners?
That it's never good when someone is able to have a quasi-monopoly of the media, because pluralistic media is essential for democracy. And he was allowed to build up his near monopoly of private TV networks before he went into politics. So that wasn't great. But then nothing was done to stop him and to enforce the separation between his businesses and his political life. So that was one thing. The other actually is Berlusconi. It's not just the structure of his media ties. Also, the content of what he put out was extremely damaging to women. He was not only a misogynist in his private life, but he pioneered a brand of entertainment TV that was based on demeaning women, having half-naked women, making jokes about women, and he personally would go around and insult women. So he set a personal example of misogyny that then was echoed in his TV programming in a very intensive way. Even news programs, there were always ways to work in misogyny. And it got so bad that by 2010, when he'd been in and out of power for a decade, the UN did a report saying that women had become much more endangered because of Berlusconi's, the combined effects of his kind of ownership of media and his misogynistic politics. So that's another caution. We sometimes think of gender as separate, but denigrating one group, in this case women, he also denigrated immigrants, Muslims, the usual suspects. It was deleterious to democracy and to civic culture as a whole.
Strongmen came out in 2020. What may have been different, if anything, if you'd written it after Trump's return to power, and after seeing the speed of the Doge, Russell vote, Trumpist, Musk takeover of the government?
The one thing I didn't see coming, although I did talk about the ambitions of Trump 1.0 to have a blitzkrieg, because Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon, and this is in the book, wanted to have 100 executive orders, and they thought of it as a strike at the state. It's just that they lacked the ability to implement. But when I look at the things that I decided to focus on of Trump 1.0, the book was written during that time. It's all too prescient. The stuff about immigration and ICE, I have passages about immigrants, legal or not, fearing the knock at the door, the classic authoritarian, the police coming to your door. I have stuff about the detention camps that had torture conditions, all the stuff about Putin, partnering with Putin. So I wouldn't change too much of it. The one thing that is new that I did not see coming was the power sharing with Musk. And as I said before, this is completely new. This is a new formula. And the other thing that's very interesting to me is we are going to read history books about the way that Trump and MAGA were able to use their time out of power because of Project 2025, which became almost like a shadow government in waiting, to the point where when Viktor Orban of Hungary came to the States, this happened twice, Orban was trying to discredit Biden, because a lot of what they were doing, MAGA and foreign allies, was discrediting democracy. So he never went to the White House. So Viktor Orban came to America. He's the head of state. You're supposed to go see the head of state in the place you're visiting. No, he snubbed Biden. Where did he go? He went to Mar-a-Lago, but he also went to the Heritage Foundation. because the Heritage Foundation was the shepherd of Project 2025, which was positioning itself as a state in waiting, a bureaucracy in waiting. So they used their time out of power in a very focused way to have a plan for a blitzkrieg. And so perhaps it's inevitable that whatever happens, Musk is supposed to be stepping back, but Doge is not ending. Musk's project is not ending. It's being taken over by Russ Vought, who is one of Project 2025's leaders. We have to be mindful that the big authoritarian state project is continuing, and Doge is actually fusing together with this other project.
To return briefly to the theme of misogyny, do you think women in the United States are currently endangered the way they started to be in Italy all these years ago?
Yes, at every level, both from the kind of so-called manosphere, the popularity of violently misogynistic, male commentators, and of course at the level of, and this again, during the years of Biden's administration, states like Texas, Oklahoma, were taking women's rights away, were putting into place extremely repressive measures and laws to take away women's bodily autonomy. Now they're criminalizing miscarriage. Anything to do with women's experience and maternity, they're trying to criminalize it. At the same time, they're promoting a kind of white Christian population explosion that the right people should have babies for the state, and the other people should be surveyed, tracked if they even cross state boundaries. This is the total authoritarian style stuff. So at every level, the discursive, cultural level, and the legal level, women are targeted.
Ruth, a friend of mine recently wrote to me that her real fear about the future in the United States is what she called an amoral and disconnected generation will not have a foundation of knowledge based on understanding past autocracies of the kind that you write about so eloquently in your books, I should say. And she continued, look who is out on the streets protesting. It looks like they let out the old people's home for a field trip. That is bizarre. Does that sound accurate? And if it does, what do you attribute it to? Why aren't there more demonstrations? Why aren't the campuses going crazy? What's going on?
Well, I think we have to have a little perspective because in 2017, the Women's March, which was multiracial, multi-generational, was the biggest protest in American history, only to be surpassed in 2020 by the Black Lives Matter demonstrations and social movement. Do you know that over 20 million Americans, over 20 million, participated in some Black Lives Matter event or protest, and it was multi-generational and multiracial. So there is a trajectory for this. And I think what's gone on since January 20th is so extreme. And also, you asked about campuses. Well, the Trump administration has very effectively kind of criminalized free speech or tried to say that anybody who protests is being anti-Semitic and used the Palestine card in ways that have, as we see, made many universities which were already under attack financially, defunding, afraid, so that students are not inclined to protest, perhaps, as much as they would be. But I don't think that we should count out young people just because the April 5th hands-off protests were mostly white and mostly older. There are plenty of pictures of crowds around the nation that were not only old. And the other thing I would say is that no country, think about Eastern Europe or anywhere, no country has been able to of the size of the United States, because the size is a bit of a problem. If our model is the centralized protests that we see in other countries, it's really big, United States. And perhaps decentralized protest is going to be the new model. But no country has been able to put together a multi-coalition, diversified pro-democracy movement in 4 months.
So the kids are all right, is what you're saying. It just has been a set of circumstances that hasn't allowed protests to, flourish.
In part, yeah. Because the fact that Black Lives Matter happened during the pandemic is huge. I mean, people came out despite the pandemic, and that energy has not gone away. The other thing I'm very interested in is the Tesla protests, which were multi-generational. And I was doing an analysis in one of my lucid sessions of them. And what made them very effective, because protest has to change too. It has to change with the times and the circumstances. What made them effective is that they were both spontaneous grassroots, decentralized protests. So that's the street level. But they also integrated economic boycott, which young people are really into that in Myanmar, in Turkey. They create apps to help people know who to boycott, which businesses. There's a lot of potential for that. And thirdly, the Tesla protests tarnished a brand. They made people ashamed of Teslas, which they'd previously been very pleased and proud of owning. It's a cool car. Look at all the features. And then people were like, oh, I'm ashamed of having a Tesla. So there's something there that we need to think about for the future. And I think perhaps the model of protest that works in other countries isn't going to work in the United States due to its size and other factors.
Just the very last question, which is a bit tricky, but thinking about advice to citizens who live under strongman rule around the world, what would be the one piece of advice you would give to them to take away with them as they proceed in this resistance survival mode?
Them meaning us, Americans.
Well, everybody, all kinds of citizens all around the world, including us.
Well, I mean, a lot of that, it's tricky also because it depends how entrenched the strongman is. If you've got a Lukashenko, that's a whole other thing, right? Then somebody's still on the ascendant. One of my rules is that you have to use the tools and spaces of opposition that you have when you have them. You have to maximize all of these tools and spaces because you don't know if you're going to have them tomorrow.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ruth. Wonderful conversation.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth.
The Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by me, Maria Repnikova.
And me, Jeremy Goldkorn. The show is edited by Cadre Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed on the guzheng by Wu Fei. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed by Wu Fei. Our cover art is by Li Yunfei.
Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, leave us a review. And if you like what we're doing, please check out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com, where you can also sign up for our newsletters. Thank you so much, Ruth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. And to the listeners, also please sign up for Lucid. You can find it on Substack.